So we just had some very peculiar PlayStation news drop after LTPS came out this past Friday, and I do not want to have to wait a whole week before we talk about this because there actually is a lot that could be happening here, but there is this new announcement, this agreement in place between the developer People Can Fly and SIE. So People Can Fly, the studio behind Bulletstorm, Outriders. They're also currently working with Microsoft right now on Gears of War E-Day. That's more of a code development agreement, but they did send out a press release confirming that they have agreed on a production cooperation for a new game that is codenamed Project Delta, which is going to be based on the intellectual property rights owned by SIE. It's also important to clarify this is labeled as a prototype development agreement, and the project is divided into milestones. So we're just clarifying that because that does rule out the possibility of them doing something where they're stepping into an existing project that's been ongoing for a little bit now. So that would be the Jason Blundell team as an example, or anything that any of the other PlayStation Studio developers are doing. So they're not stepping into anything new. This, from the ground up, is new. They're doing a prototype, and based on milestones, we could see the game either continue to pass and see it all the way through to being shipped, or of course, SIE could step in at some point if they don't reach a certain build or milestone and cancel the game, which is also not entirely outside the realms of impossibility here because SIE's been pretty firm with cancellations lately, a lot of that being live service stuff, and given what People at Fly have developed before, with it being shooters and multiplayer games, it's also a very realistic possibility that we are looking at another multiplayer and, yes, live service game. But before we get into the weeds of that, we should also mention that the statement they put out, the press release for this agreement with SIE, is very similar to the one that they announced with Microsoft on their partnership, which was code development on Gears of War. And that was codenamed Project Maverick at the time. But it's important to mention that because the language was very similar, right? So there's already a lot of speculation running wild on what exactly this game, this prototype, this existing IP could be. And to be fair, you could read this as an IP that is new because it just would mean that, like, SIE owns it, right? Which is very, well, I want to say common. It's actually not that common nowadays when Sony contracts out a studio to make a game, because oftentimes, depending on the studio and the particular arrangement, a lot of times nowadays the IP does not always strictly belong to Sony. It's very different from the really PS4, PS3 days where pretty much everything they were paying for, they were always asking for IP ownership, but I digress on that. Point being, it could be a scenario of they're contracting them out, it's their IP, therefore they own it, so whether it's new or old, there is some plausibility that it could still be a new IP, although it does very much read as an existing IP. Which we can also, not to go off the rails again here, but this does align with a recent statement back in January of this year, which was Hermen Hulst saying, and I quote with Famitsu, "The numerous IPs that we hold are an important asset for PlayStation, and as part of our efforts to strengthen our portfolio, not only developing new franchises, we are also continuously looking at opportunities to leverage our legacy IP." Now, if you remember at the time too, when that statement came out, it's still something where that's the most PR answer you can give as far as like, hey, look at, because the question at hand with Famitsu was, Astrobot came out, look at all these cameo VIP bots. Do you ever think about going back to these old games like, say, Ape Escape or something like that, right? Because there's so many IP and things in Astrobot. But that was Hermen's answer. And it's like, he's not going to sit there and say, like, no, we're never going to do that. Or I think we should just let all those IPs sit to rest. Yeah, they kind of understand that no matter what, they're always going to give this answer of, we are continuously looking at leveraging our old properties, or we have respect for our lineage and we're always thinking about it. They're always going to give some kind of answer like that. But it still seems somewhat noteworthy, and, you know, PlayStation has never been shy of going back to the toolbox, as it were, or the treasure box, the closet, pulling out an old IP. We know they're doing that in droves for PlayStation Productions, of all things, so we're seeing a lot of things get adapted to TV and film. So it's like, sure, I mean, will they revisit an old IP? It's always a possibility, a distinct possibility. And so in this case, we do have a studio that is well known for shooters, multiplayer games. The company is wanting to do more live service. They're not, you know, again, they're not really walking away from that per se, but they are going to be a lot more careful with it, given the trials and tribulations that they've had with so many cancellations, which I'll always argue it's better to cancel a game than ship 12 losers, right? It's one of those things where they're kind of applying the Sony method in some ways. But that's also getting into the weeds of, like situations like seeing Concord that was shipped all the way through. But given that game, that's why they want to be a bit more careful. The roundabout point I want to make here is that because it's multiplayer, because it's probably going to be live service, because it's in the prototype phase and it has to pass many milestones, we are looking at a game that in theory is so far away and very likely, well, I don't want to say very likely, I don't, but there's a distinct possibility that this thing doesn't even come out. But if it does, I mean, it's like 6-something years away. This is a PlayStation 6 game for all intents and purposes. Having said that, there are some big IP that immediately when we look into the PlayStation closet, it's like, oh, Resistance, Killzone, SOCOM, the sort of big three that everyone tends to bring up here. I've also seen some speculation about how, maybe this is a studio that can start to handle The Last of Us multiplayer, since that was obviously canceled as well. And the issue with that being that project would have consumed all of Naughty Dog. And there's been a lot of conversation surrounding how that game was in a very good playable state, nearly finished. A lot of people, time and money was put into that project. Why can't they just find a different studio to take over the project, lead it, ship it, and then maintain it so Naughty Dog is not tied up with it? And as sort of simple as that seems on paper, obviously there's a logistical nightmare involved with moving all that stuff over. And then, that IP is very boutique to Sony in a way. I'm not entirely sure they're going to be as willing to just give that to anybody. It's very hard to find good talent and the kind of talent you can reasonably trust. And SIE is still generally very conservative in that landscape. I mean, this goes back to their methodology with acquiring studios, which is they just don't really go out and do M&A activity for the hell of it. It takes a long time for a certain studio to sort of be sized up and be a good candidate for SIE. And so that's not necessarily the option I would consider as what is happening here, especially again saying we can already rule it out because they said it's a prototype, but I mean, yeah, Killzone, Resistance, I'd love for that to be the case. I don't want to get hopes up here, but there was a post over on Reset Era where there's just one user claiming that they've got a friend that works on Sony's IP management team, or they did up to September 2024, and they mentioned that they were exploring the Resistance IP with a project in code development. However, the only other thing they've mentioned, and they knew at the time, which was around June 2024, is that PSVR was in this conversation. So this is likely an entirely different thing. But hey, fingers crossed for those who like Resistance. Not my thing, Delta does mean 4. And that's one post where it's obviously a random forum poster, but Reset Era is very much the place where people sit and sort of be anonymous and talk about things they've heard about the game as business. It would not at all be the first time we've found out about these things on Era or any other places online. So it's not something I want to get hopes up out there, or even my hopes, because that's the one, oddly enough, that's the one PlayStation IP I feel somewhat strongly about as far as if it could come back or not, because I always make this point, which is every time this comes up of look at all these old IP Sony owns, why don't they do something with it? It's just logistically, what are you talking about? I mean, certain things are just not going to come back, and we have to be fine with that as fans. We have to think about the business in games, what it takes to bring a property back, the financial viability of it, the modern audience, and how you can market and sell that game to that audience. There's just so many verticals that have to be looked at, and we can't just say these IP can come back. I don't know, I've always been of the mind where most of it is not coming back. Resistance, I feel, is going to fill a very unique slot in Sony's lineup in their portfolio, which is a sci-fi first-person shooter, alternate history. I think there's just a lot there if they sort of do a soft reboot of the franchise, which I would actually think, if this is Resistance 4, that one, I would prefer it to be a sort of soft reboot. It doesn't really need to be a 4 or a proper sequel. Maybe like a God of War 2018 where it respects the original 3 games, but you can kind of go into this playing it brand new. Maybe something like that. But also you would think that this would be very much a code development scenario with Insomniac. Because I'm also always very nervous as far as giving the IP to a brand new studio, and there's very little oversight between the teams. I mean, oftentimes there's a little bit of back and forth as far as, is this right with the lore? Are we keeping up with the characters? Does this make sense? What about this gameplay loop? And there will always be a feedback loop there in place to make sure that they're going in the right direction, but that doesn't always guarantee that these projects turn out okay. I think about Resistance Burning Skies by Nihilistic, for example, on PlayStation Vita. These things can go south very quickly. They can also go well. I really like Sly Cooper Thieves in Time by Sanzaru Games, for example. That's me personally. I know some Sly fans don't like that game, but it goes both ways, obviously. But I will leave the speculation there. I don't want to talk too much more about what is very clearly super far away. But I think this was a really interesting thing to sort of wake up to, which is, oh, okay. I mean, we don't get these press releases letting us know about this too frequently from their sort of PlayStation Studio XDev partnerships, which this is very much that, basically. With that in mind, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.